What I'm going to show you today is how to modify a main pattern piece in really any bag and add a zipper pocket like this one. So I've been asked this question numerous times whenever there is a back pattern, either mine or other designers. And let's say that this is a back panel, by the way, for my Alice bag. And a lot of you are wondering how to add a zipper pocket across the entire panel without distorting the shape and distorting the size and proportion of that panel. And I thought this is such a quick and easy hack that let me just pop in here on YouTube and film it for you. So what you want to do is to grab your main panel piece. It doesn't really matter if you are adding it to your external panel or a lining panel. For the purpose of this demonstration, I made this zipper pocket on the lining. So this is the back panel for my lining piece. I've got the pattern piece here, which is, as you can see, in one piece. So there is no zipper pocket in the original pattern. And what I'm going to show you is how to actually add that zipper pocket. So this is what it looks like when your pocket is finished. This is the front of the pocket. This is the back. And obviously, if I open the zipper, we have our lined zipper pocket bags. So I'm going to show you how to use your main pattern piece and divide it into different sections to create individual pattern pieces so you can put this pocket together. So let me start. As always, let me know in the comments if you've got any questions while you are watching. If you are familiar with this hack, I would love to find out. So I've got extra piece of paper here. I'm hoping you can actually see the difference because I didn't have a colored paper, but I'm hoping you will be able to figure out and see what I'm doing. So first, what you want to do, let me put this aside for a second. First, what you want to do is to decide, where is my pen? Here you go. First, what you want to do is to decide on the position of your zipper pocket, or of the zipper. So this is your pocket opening. What I've done here is I use the main pattern piece, so the back lining piece, as a starting point, and the entire pocket is basically from the moment my zipper is to, and this whole area. So what you want to do is to decide on the position of that zipper. So grab your main pattern piece. Like I mentioned, it doesn't matter if it's external or lining pieces. Then what you want to do is to decide on the position of that zipper. So for the purpose of this demonstration, let me just measure about, I don't know, 4 centimeters from the top. So what you want to do is to draw a line. If your pattern piece has like a rounded or curved shape, or maybe it's oddly shaped because you are not using one of my pieces, then it doesn't really matter. What you want to do is to decide where you want that zipper to be placed. If you want, you can place it diagonally or at slight angle. It is really up to you. The process of creating those individual pattern pieces is really the same. You just have to pay attention to your grain line and just to pay attention basically to make sure all those pieces that we're going to create, once you put them together to sew this pocket, they end up being the original shape of your pattern. So I've got Marsha here. Thank you, Marsha, for telling me you can hear and see me properly. So that's always good to know. So now that we have this first line, which by the way is the top edge of my zipper, what you want to do next is to find out the visible portion of the zipper. This area here, where is my zipper, how wide this area is really depends on the type of the zipper you are using and also on what's the seam allowance that you're going to use. So, for example, let me show you. I've got my zipper here. This is number 5 continuous zipper. What you want to do is to measure the width of that zipper. So mine is about 32 millimeters. Let me just write this here maybe so I don't forget it. So 32 millimeters. Now, I'm gonna grab my calculator. So what you want to do next is to decide what is the seam allowance that you're going to use to sew your zipper. So it doesn't really matter what's the seam allowance throughout the entire project. What I like to do, for example, I prefer to use slightly smaller seam allowance whenever I'm sewing the zipper. And then everywhere else to construct my bag, I like to use slightly larger seam allowance. So for example, I like to use 7 millimeters seam allowance. So that's like 1/4 of an inch, let's say. What you want to do is to deduct your seam allowance twice from the overall width of your zipper tape, because you are sewing your zipper on both sides. So for the purpose of this lesson, let's say I'm using 7 millimeters seam allowance. So 7 plus 7 is 14. So I'm just going to deduct 32 millimeters, which is the width of the entire zipper tape. And I'm going to deduct that 14 millimeters, which is twice my seam allowance. And that is 18 millimeters. So I know that the visible portion of the zipper for me is 18 millimeters. Whenever you are hacking and modifying patterns, you need to make sure you understand the correlation between your seam allowances, the size of your zipper, and any other aspects and that affect the size of your pattern pieces. If you just cut your pattern piece along this line and then sew your zipper, sew your pocket, it probably will work more or less, but the proportion of your main panel may be either shorter or longer, depending on the width of your zipper and also the seam allowances you are using. So instead of just praying for the best, I actually prefer to create separate pattern pieces and have them aside for later, or I can use them in the future projects. And then when you know how to modify a simple panel to add your zipper pocket like this, it's very easy to modify any other bag, because if you are using something like this rectangle, this is a little bit tapered along the bottom, but it is more or less rectangle. If you just simply cut along this line and then sew your pocket, still you will end up with a rectangle pattern. But imagine if it was like a circle bag, or maybe like very unusual shape panel. If you just cut it and then you kind of stretch it out, or shrink it because of the seam allowances and the size of your zipper, it may not work as it should be. So forgive my phone, I forgot to silence it. Happens, life happens. So what you want to do now, once you know the visible portion of your zipper, we're going to draw another line that is parallel to the first line. So for me, in my example, that is 18 millimeters. So I'm simply taking my ruler and I'm measuring 18 millimeters, and I'm going to draw a line across one more time. So this area here is where my zipper will be situated, where I'm going to stitch my zipper. So that is the zipper the pocket opening basically. So now that we have the placement of our zipper, we can start creating individual pattern pieces. So first, let me show you what pattern pieces we need. So as you can see on the front, we need the main zipper, the main panel. Then we need like this top trim. And if I flip this over, we need another pattern piece that is longer than the front, because if I open the zipper, it has to go behind that zipper. So it needs to be taller. So that's why simply cutting the pattern and, you know, trying to figure out how to stitch your pocket can be misleading, because the bottom, the pattern that is the fabric piece that is behind will end up too short if you don't account for how this pocket is assembled. So instead of just, you know, cutting your pattern and hoping for the best, it's always best to create those individual pattern pieces. So now that I have this, I'm going to grab my paper. I hope you can see the difference. But what you want to do first is to trace the bottom part of your main panel. So what I like to do is to actually fold my pattern along the bottom edge. So you can do that, but since there is like a paper hanging below, it might be difficult to trace. So I show you some other way to do it. So take your spare paper, place your pattern on top. What I'm going to do is I'm going to line up the bottom edge as is. This pattern piece already includes seam allowances. So if I just quickly mark them here, I'm using 1 centimeter seam allowance to construct my bag. And that's basically what my pattern looks like. So if your pattern already has seam allowances like mine, what you have to do is to just place it on top of your paper and trace it around. You don't really have to worry about adding seam allowances around those edges. We are only going to add seam allowances to the edges where the zipper is going to be stitched, because we basically need to divide this panel in 3 different sections. So first, what you can do is to place it like so. I'm just going to line it up along the bottom edge. Now, using my ruler, I'm going to quickly trace the side edges. Next, since we are tracing the first pattern piece up to this bottom line, what you can do is to either use tracing wheel, or if you don't have it, just simply mark a couple of notches at the end, just so you know exactly where that line is positioned. So I'm going to draw this line now, but because this line represents the stitching line, so this line here is basically where I stitched my zipper here, we need to add seam allowances to that edge. And because we had to calculate the visible portion of the zipper, we already know what seam allowance we are using. So for me, I'm using 7 millimeters seam allowance. So I'm going to take my ruler now and simply draw a parallel line above. So this area here is my seam allowance that I'm going to use to sew the zipper. Everything else stays the same. since my pattern already has seam allowances included. So now what you can do is to trace your grain line and add your labels. So I'm just going to quickly do that. I'm using the bottom edge of my pattern to draw perpendicular line to mark my grain line. And we can call this main panel. So I'm just going to write Alice bag, since this is the pattern that I'm using. And I'm going to write main pocket panel. You can call it zipper pocket, however you want to name your pattern pieces. You can you can name them however you like, basically. And we need to cut it 2 times from lining fabric. Why 2 times? Because we have one piece that is visible from the outside, and then when I open the zipper, we have the same pattern piece as the lining. So if you are adding your zipper pocket to the outer portion of your bag, this would be cut from external fabric. So if you are adding it to the exterior of your bag, you will need to cut this piece 1 time from external fabric and then 1 time from your lining fabric. But again, because I'm adding my zipper pocket to the interior of my bag, I've cut everything from lining fabric. So now I've got this, I can simply cut it out. I'm not going to do that now because I don't want to waste your time. But what we can do next is to create the next pattern, which is going to be the top trim. So that's going to be the leftover of what is from that main panel. So again, what I'm going to do now is to line it up, this edge, that top edge, with my paper, because I already have seam allowances around, and because we are tracing this top edge, we only need to trace it up to the top edge of our zipper. Because again, if we look at this finished pocket, you can see that this top trim ends at the top edge, so where we marked our very first line. So I'm just flipping it upside down. I'm just going to line it up with the edge of my paper, and again I'm tracing it. So I'm going to trace my side edges as they are. I'm going to mark where is that line, so it's easier for me to draw this line like so. And now we need to add seam allowance so we can sew our zipper. So again, I'm using 7mm seam allowance, and that's exactly what I'm going to add. Here we go. So this is what my pattern piece looks like. So this is the correct direction of it. So what I'm going to do next is to add my grain line, so I know how to cut it out. Let me just cut this out, because otherwise it's hard for me to actually do that. And now we can add our label. So I'm going to write Alice bag. So I'm going to call this top trim. You can call this pocket trim. Again, name it however you like. And I'm going to cut it 1 time from lining fabric, because again, I'm adding my pocket to the interior of my bag. If you are adding it to the outer portion of your bag, you will need to cut it from external fabric instead. And just like that, we've created another pattern piece. We already have seam allowances along the sides and along the top edge, so we don't have to worry about them. You can simply cut out your pattern. And lastly, what we're going to do is to create the remaining pattern piece for that pocket bag. So the one that is behind the zipper, which is longer than the main pattern. So what you want to do for this pattern piece is to trace your main panel up to the top line. So the first time we were tracing it up to the bottom line. Now, because it has to go behind the zipper, we need to trace it up to the top line. So again, I'm going to line up my bottom edges. Since I have my seam allowances everywhere, I can just use the edge of my paper to trace my side edges. I'm going to mark those notches so I know exactly where is that stitching line. We can lift that and draw the line. And again, because we need to stitch this piece to the zipper, we need to add seam allowance. And you are always adding the same seam allowance throughout those pieces because you are sewing the zipper either along the top or along the bottom, and you already decided what seam allowance you're going to use. So I've got that pattern piece ready as well. I'm going to use the bottom edge to draw my grain line and add my label. So Ali's bag. So I'm going to call this pocket bag, and we need to cut it one time from lining fabric. For this, you will always have to cut it from lining fabric because it is inside your pocket. So it doesn't matter if you are adding your pocket to the outer or inner portion of your bag. This pattern piece always needs to be cut from lining fabric. And just like that, you've created your pattern pieces. So you can cut them out, cut out your fabric, and then you can very easily add a zipper pocket just like this one to any bag you want. It is super easy hack. I absolutely love those types of modifications because they don't require too much thinking. You saw how easy it was and how quick it was. And once you construct your pocket, once you put all those three pieces together, you will end up, if you are going to use the same seam allowances that you decided to use, you will end up with this panel. So then you can easily follow the sewing instructions and finish constructing your entire project. And just like that, you modified and customized your bag. So I hope you found this tutorial helpful. I told you it's going to be very, very quick. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions, if you want to see other projects or other pattern hacks like this in the future from me. Otherwise, I shall see you in the next video. Stay crafty, friends!